Not doing it will be catastrophic. We'll have 8 degrees, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in 10, not 10, but in 30 or 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people who are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan, and living conditions will be intolerable. The droughts will be so bad there'll be no more corn growing. Not doing it is suicide. Just like dropping bombs on each other, nuclear weapons is suicide. So we've got to stop doing the two suicidal things, which are hanging on to our nuclear weapons
and globalization.
And then after that, we've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there were
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. But if there were less people, they'd be using less stuff.
Hi, this is Dr. Joe Green, head pastor of Antioch Assembly Church located in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Also, the founder of the 2019 movement, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with you. If you've been following the movement or some of the videos I've been making, I've been talking a lot about globalism and just kind of painting the picture of, you know, this current strife that we have in the country is primarily globalism versus nationalism. Now, there's a lot of different facets of it, a lot of different aspects of that. This also coming into play, but at the end of the day, if you wanted to kind of make a clear distinction, it's globalism versus nationalism. Now, anytime you look at a country or a nation or a group of people, there's 3 major components that are at play that you have to really examine, especially in a country. So we're talking about nations, we're talking about countries here. Like I said, globalism versus nationalism. And so the 3 major components that you should look at is the government, economics, and religion. Government, economics, and religion. In a democracy or representative republic like we live in, there's 3 classes of people. Now, just for the record, we don't live in a democracy. The United States is not a democracy. What the United States is a representative republic that's governed by the rule of law. A representative republic ruled by the governed by the rule of law. And the reason it's important to make a distinction is because a democracy is just majority rule. So in a democracy, as long as you have 51% of anything, anything can become a law. For instance, and I'm just using this for example, this may sound far-fetched, but in a democracy, if 51% of the people voted to allow cannibalism to be legal, it would become law. In a representative republic that's governed by the rule of law, we have a constitution. And we have amendments to the Constitution. We have the balance of powers. So we have the executive branch where the president is. We have the legislative branch where is our Congress. And we also have the judicial branch where the Supreme Court is. Now, the Congress or the legislative branch is the branch that actually makes the laws. Now, they're held accountable by the voters. So the voters vote them in. And then they every couple of years they have another election and they can be voted back in or voted out. Anytime a law is passed, if there's a challenge to the law, it goes before the Supreme Court and they determine the constitutionality of that particular law. That's the only thing the Supreme Court does. They don't make laws. They just determine the constitutionality of a law. Within the representative republic, you have 3 classes of people. You have the middle class, the upper class, and then you have the poverty or the lower class. Another term for that, just to give you some insight, you don't have to know this or remember this, but you have the proletariat, the bourgeoisie, and the oligarchy. So the bourgeoisie is the middle class. They're the property owners, and they're the ones that actually drive the economy. In our current system, there is what's called vertical mobility. And what vertical mobility is it means you can move up or down in our current economic system, economic status, if you will. If you were born in poverty, you can move up and become middle class, or you can even become wealthy. You look at somebody like LeBron James. He was raised to a single mother. Most likely they weren't wealthy when he was growing up, but now he's in the elite class, right? He's worth almost $1 billion because there is vertical mobility in our economic system. We live in a free market capital system. So in free market capitalism, it helps to create and to maintain wealth. There's a lot of wealth is created and maintained because of free market capitalism, and a lot of times, the free market actually corrects itself. So, as long as the United States government, their job is only to regulate, to make sure everything is fair. If there's one company that becomes a monopoly and they're dominating the field, and it's unfair, business practices, then the government steps in and they have antitrust laws or anti-monopoly laws. That's the purpose of the government. But at the end of the day, it's the free market capital system that creates and maintains wealth. Communism is the system of the New World Order, one world governmental system, and from now on, as I refer to this communism system of the New World Order, I'm going to refer to it as globalism or the globalistic system. So whenever you hear me say globalism, I'm talking about this communistic New World Order system. Communism has collective economics. Instead of rich businessmen, middle class, and the poor, they have what's known as the oligarchs and the working class. So you have the ruling class, and then you have the worker class, which is everybody else. The government is the ruling class, and they decide everything on the economics and the religious side. So anytime you get into a globalistic system, it is the ruling class that actually determines how the economics is regulated or used, and they also control religion or the religious side. There's no vertical mobility in the communistic system. Religion is forbidden altogether or controlled by the government or the oligarchs, the ruling class in communistic system. And in order to transition from a free market representative republic like we have now to a system, to the globalist system, they have to do away with religion and they have to do away with the middle class. So they attack religion, they attack the middle class. Religion and strong families are the biggest enemy of the globalistic system. Strong nuclear families, traditional marriage, man and woman, strong nuclear families, and religion, more specifically Christianity, is the biggest obstacle to the globalist. And they've said it in their book. So the stuff that I'm sharing with you is not my opinion. They've written that, they've strategized this, and it's out there. Strong nation states, which is the United States is a nation state, with strong families are the major obstacle in implementing the plan for the globalist New World Order. So they have to attack strong families, and like I said, the middle class has to be done away with. In the midst of a poor economic trend, socialism is always offered as a solution to help the middle class and the lower class survive. So you always have, whenever there's an economic downturn, what they do is they offer socialism as a solution. So when you look at the stock market crash in 1929, the FDR came up with the New Deal or whatever it was called, and it was a form of socialism. So they offered that as the solution, if you will, to a downward economic trend. If you know, in the 1960s, when there was a lot of turmoil, LBJ came with what was called the Great Society, or if you will, the war on poverty. These were it was a form of socialism that was offered up to as a solution for the turmoil in the country and economic trend, downtrend, especially in the minority community. So what LBJ did was he understood economics and psychology, and he knew that if they started these social programs and they targeted poor and minority people, that it would cause them to be more dependent on the government, and it would also cause them to be more complacent. So in the 60s, you had a lot of upheaval, and the black people were really, fighting for civil rights. You had riots in certain areas. So LBJ and the globalists, they understood that in order to kind of get that not to happen anymore, they came up with what they called the war on poverty, and they targeted minorities with these social programs. And because the distrust that the minorities had for the government now goes away, because if the government is actually helping to feed your children and feed your family, then that distrust goes away, and they understood that, which is why they orchestrated the war on poverty. Since in the 1960s, since the war on poverty, they've spent $22 trillion on the war on poverty, on social programs and helping the poor and needy, but the effects have not, there's more people below the poverty line now than there was in the 60s. The family unit is weaker than it was in the 60s. So in the 1960s, I believe the number was about 22% or so of black children were born out of wedlock. Now that number has tripled to over 72% of black babies are born outside of wedlock. So the family unit is weaker. And so a lot of people blame slavery and Jim Crow, and that's not it. That's not it, because think about this. From 1865, when slavery was abolished, you had slavery being abolished, you had Jim Crow. So the family unit was still strong in the black community. But just since the 1960s, the number has gone from 22% out of wedlock to 72%. So slavery and Jim Crow has nothing to do with that. When you look at the crime rates are more. You have a higher percentage of black males incarcerated just since the 1960s. So you can't blame racism and you can't blame economics, because we have more wealth than we did back in the 60s. There was more racism during the time of Jim Crow and in the South than it is now. So you can't blame those things. So when you look at the causative strategy that they had, or if you look at the causation, you can attribute the fact that now they targeted minorities with these social programs, a form of socialism, because the aim of socialism is to encourage dependency on the government. And again, the reason that black people had stopped rioting so much because of these social programs that gave the impression that the government now was trying to look out for people, but actually was causing more governmental dependency. Socialism is the intermediary between democracy and communism. So if you want to go from the free market capitalism, democracy, representative republic, to communism, socialism is the bridge that they use in order to move from one system to another system. The ultimate goal of the globalists is for a one world government, international economic system, and to either control or do away with Christianity. That's their ultimate goal, and they've written that. If you read the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, he talked about that. He talked about the strategy. He talked about also stirring up racial unrest and all these things. So again, these are things that they wrote. They expressed this. It's not opinion, and then when you see the results happening, it's very easy to connect the dots. Now, there's currently 195 nations that are recognized as nations and in the world, but with the United Nations, or the one world governmental system, so the United Nations is actually a tool of the globalists. They're trying to get it from 195 independent nations down to 10 regional sectors. So instead of having nation states, 195 of them, they're trying to get it down to 10 regional sectors. And they have to destroy individual nations, such as the United States, in order to achieve their goals. So they can't have strong independent nations, especially the United States, which the United States is a force against the, right now in its current state, to defend against a one world governmental system, that globalists. And if you do away with the sovereignty of the United States, which is why open borders policy is part of their strategy to destroy nations, and also doing away with a single language. So instead of English being the primary language of the United States, they're allowing for, bilingual and multilingual cultures. I'm not saying this, if you came from a Spanish speaking or whatever nation you came from, I'm not saying that you should ignore your original language or your culture. But what I'm saying is, anytime you want to destroy a nation, if you get rid of a common language, then it helps to erode the strength of the nation and the stability of the nation, which is why I was was it last year, 2 years ago, I was down in Miami, Florida, and I was in a section of Miami where nobody spoke English. And when I walked in the store, it was a main chain store, was the Marshalls down there. I went in and looked for something, and nobody understood English, and they looked at me like I was a bad guy because I didn't understand Spanish. And so that's one of the strategies of the globalists in order to erode the stability of any nation. Now, post World War II, they had came up with a map, and so after World War II, and if you read Albert Pike's writings, Albert Pike said that the strategy of the globalists, of the New World Order, was they had 3 world wars that they were going to plan, and those 3 world wars would help them to move to a one world governmental system. So after World War II, they had what was called the League of Nations, and then the League of Nations was the forerunner for the United Nations. So now they have the United Nations, and all these are tools of the globalists. But there was this article, this talking about a 1942 article that was published in Philadelphia in 1942. It was the outline of the post-war New World Map created by Maurice Gomberg, and Gomberg is spelled Gomberg. And it shows a proposal to rearrange the world after an Allied victory against the Axis forces. Its title refers to a New World Order, a vague concept at the time, but it's now many definitions offer contradictory to each other. At the core of the New World Order, however, is always the notion that a small group of powerful individuals, institutions, and industries and or nations must lead the world in the right direction.
So you have two forces. The American revolutionaries, who were influenced by the writings of Thomas Paine, who wrote that a monarchical tradition of rulers with kingdoms being passed down from father to son is about as absurd as a tradition of artists where the son becomes an artist just because his father was. In other words, being a good ruler is not something that can be passed down through blood. You have those founding fathers being influenced by the likes of Thomas Paine, John Locke, and you have another force of the ancient royal bloodlines of Europe who wanted to maintain power at all costs and were used to a feudal system of rulership, and who viewed the commoners as nothing more than cattle, than property. Two forces, one out of America, one out of Britain, the British Empire and the American Empire. Now, the American, quote, empire, for all its shortcomings, and of course every country has its flaws, but at least the American empire was built on a tradition of individual liberty and free market capitalism. It was built on a tradition of innovation and personal human empowerment, as opposed to the British Empire system of enslavement and subjugation and deceit. The British Empire system spread throughout so many areas of the world after the fall of Napoleon. It was really the last man standing, the last nation standing in Europe in terms of power after the fall of Napoleon. And the British Empire was adept at infiltration and spreading its empire through stealth, deceit. They would go into a region and stir up strife between the populations, divide and conquer. They would do things like sell opium to the population to get them drugged, to keep them hooked on the product so that they could extract resources. They would form so-called democratic governments in nations, which were basically just puppets of the British Empire. You look at someone like Cecil Rhodes, for example, going into Africa and creating the De Beers Diamond Company and using slave labor of Africans to build his diamond empire, monopolizing the entire market on diamonds and charging huge prices for nothing more than a semi-precious stone, a diamond. These were the tactics of the British Empire system, whereas the American Empire was built on industry and invention. You look at the inventions of the American Empire prior to the 1900s. So many inventions. Why? Because the United States had individual liberty. It had what was the closest thing to a free market the world had ever known. The people had individual rights to explore and to develop inventions and industry. But Cecil Rhodes mentioned in his will that he wanted to recapture America. England has never really let go of America because it considered America its number one threat. If the American system of free market capitalism, of invention, of innovation ever caught on throughout the world, the British Empire would lose its grasp of power over the world. The ancient royal families of Europe partnered with the Rothschilds to form central banks throughout Europe after the fall of Napoleon. The ancient royal families of Europe knew that they were losing control of this idea of kingdoms. People were growing out of this idea of being ruled over like serfs. They were growing out of the idea that they needed a king. So they decided to partner with the likes of the Rothschilds to put us under a form of slavery, a more sophisticated form of slavery, a form of slavery that was financial in nature, to where they would get the very governments of these people who thought they were free. They would get their governments in debt, and they would use that debt to extract the tax money from the serfs. And all along, they thought they were free because they were electing people into office, never understanding the financial system of banking that had enslaved them again, even without their knowledge. Until we return again to a type of neo-feudalism with oligarchical financial interests controlling our governments like puppets, collecting our tax money to pay off the interest on the debt that our government owes these private banks. We call them central banks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Rothschilds set up all of these central banks. The British Empire's strategy changed from one of force to one of stealth. They would set up so-called democratic governments in all the nations of the world, and they would set up central banks to loan those governments money at interest. Then they would collect tax dollars to pay the interest to the private central banks, thus extracting wealth from all the nations and creating a form of neo-feudalism. And in fact, if you look at who actually owns the deeds and the titles to all the property in the United States of America and in most other nations, you see that they are owned by the same banks that make up the central banks of the countries. So in fact, we are under a type of neo-feudalism. Banks are the only organizations that are given the permission to create money out of nothing. In other words, you buy a house for $200,000, that money didn't exist before they wrote the mortgage. Once they write it, it does exist. The money is created out of thin air. Yet you spend the next 30 years of your life paying the principal and interest on the money that the bank pulled out of the hat. If that is not slavery, there is no other definition for slavery.
Unification is one of the terms that they use. So United Nations, unification, they're trying to unite the nations together as one. And one of the most recent references, if you recall, President George H.W. Bush or President George Bush Sr., he did a couple of speeches, one in particular to Congress, where he made reference to a New World Order. And he referred to the New World Order to the U.S. objectives in the post-Cold World War. So after the Cold War we had with Russia, he said this is a great opportunity for us to form a New World Order. And because as long as you had two superpowers that opposed each other, it helped to create an environment where there was no possibility for a one world governmental system. So after the Cold World War, he said this is a great opportunity for us to form this new world order. The term has a pedigree much older than the Cold War, even in both wars. Some might even say, and we're now saying, that back in the Roman times, it was attested by the modified quote of the Roman poet Virgil on the reverse of the U.S. Great Seal, significantly or not, since 1935, on the back of the dollar bill, Novus Ordo Seclorum literally means a new world order. A new order for the ages. So if you look on the back of your dollar, you see Novus Ordo Seclorum. Seclorum is world, which is where you get the term secular from. Of course, novus is new, and ordo is order. So a new world order is what they're trying to move towards. So you have the Federal Reserve, which is a part of the international banking cartel, the Rothschilds, international bankers, the global elite, whatever you want to call them. They're moving towards a new world order and finishing the job that they started in Genesis 11, and they have the picture right there on the back of your dollar bill. So they're not making any secrets about this, and they're pretty bold in what they're intending to do. Now, in the modern context, it was the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes, and he's a very key figure. That's where they got the African nation Rhodesia from. He was a globalist. He was a British imperialist. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Cecil Rhodes, but the name of the nation Rhodesia came from Cecil Rhodes. Now they've changed it back, but it was called Rhodesia.
Over the years, different groups of these secret societies have emerged for specific tasks. And because the agenda has a specific time scale, and across the millennium is the time of introduction, Through this century, this agenda has been advanced quicker and quicker and quicker. Towards the end of the last century, and right at the start of this one, a secret society was created in Britain, not surprisingly, called the Round Table. Was headed up originally by a guy called Cecil Rhodes, who was one of the bloodline families that orchestrated the manipulation and takeover of southern Africa by Britain. Also, Rhodes scholarships came out of this guy, Cecil Rhodes. I think I mentioned those earlier, where the youngsters of the bloodlines around the world are picked up and given a Rhodes scholarship to Oxford University. This comes out of the same guy. Well, he died in 1902, and other people took over. And there were roundtable groups, interlocking, set up around the world. The key places were America and Britain. And when we had the First World War, the key people in the American War Administration were members of this round table, and the key people in the cabinet in Britain were members of this same round table. So they orchestrated the First World War, and afterwards, when they were deciding how the world would be redrawn as a result of the war, the very same members of the round table were appointed to the Versailles Peace Conference to decide how it would be set up and redrawn. Classic problem, reaction, solution. Create the problem, create the war, get the reaction, something must be done, and then offer the solution. At that Versailles Peace Conference, again in Paris, the cities and locations keep reoccurring, they had a meeting at the Hotel Majestic in Paris in 1919, these roundtable members, both sides of the Atlantic, and they started to orchestrate the creation of offshoot organizations around this central core that would push this agenda on through the 20th century. The first one created was the Royal Institute of International Affairs in 1920 in London. Still going strong today, a major part of this network. In 1921, in America, came the Council on Foreign Relations, which is subordinate to the London Royal Institute of International Affairs. Since 1921, virtually every president and endless major positions in the administrations of both parties have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations. You cannot become an ambassador for the United States today without being a member of this private organization. In 1954 came the Bilderberg Group, set up at the Bilderberg Hotel in Oosterbeek, Holland. And this, like the Trilateral Commission that came in 1972-73, these organizations coordinate the same agenda between apparently unconnected areas of our lives. So, for instance, the people that attend and are members of these groups are the top people in the global military, global politics, global banking, global business, global media, etc. And so through these organizations, the same policy is coordinated. And I'll just give you one example of what I mean. The Bosnian War has been an example, magnificent example, of all these elements that I'm talking about. First of all, it was problem, reaction, solution. You had the problem, the war, the reaction, something must be done, and the solution, a 60,000 strong world army under NATO control, which has advanced the agenda closer to the world army, which is the great goal of this agenda. People like Henry Kissinger, Kissinger Associates, and Lord Carrington, founding director of Kissinger Associates, were the key manipulators of the Bosnian War, among many others. So when you take that into account, and then you look at these organizations, and you look at the key peace negotiators in Bosnia, throughout that period of that war and conflict, some incredible coincidences start to unfold. When the war started, the European Union appointed the first peace negotiator, Lord Carrington. Lord Carrington, founding director of Kissinger Associates that orchestrated the war. Lord Carrington, chairman of the Bilderberg Group since 1991. President of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Trilateral Commission member. When he failed to achieve peace in Bosnia and the war went on, along came another European Union peace negotiator, Lord David Owen, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, and he was replaced when the war went on by Carl Bildt, the Swedish Prime Minister, Bilderberg Group. Working with them through this same period were the United Nations appointed peace negotiators. The first one was Cyrus Vance, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. He was replaced by a Norwegian, Thorvald Stoltenberg. Trilateral Commission, Bilderberg Group. The war went on. The horrors went on. The clamor, something must be done, got louder and louder, politically and in terms of the general public. It was time to play the sting. Onto the stage, first of all, came Jimmy Carter, an independent peace negotiator, former president. Jimmy Carter, first Trilateral Commission president of the United States, Council on Foreign Relations member. And then came the team that introduced the sting, the solution, the World Army. This was led by Richard Holbrooke, Bill Clinton's peace envoy. Richard Holbrooke, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. He answered to the Secretary of State at the time in America, Warren Christopher, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, who worked with William Perry, the Defense Secretary at the time, Bilderberg Group, and they answered to the President, Bill Clinton, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, who answered to the unelected David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, leading executives of the Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations. The first head of the World Army appointed in Bosnia was Admiral Leighton Smith, Council on Foreign Relations. And the ambassador in the former Yugoslavia through this period was Warren Zimmerman, Council on Foreign Relations. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. But unless you do this research, you think all these people are independent, when actually they're all connected. This roundtable network also accounts for the coordination of the media, because if you look at the three television networks in America, NBC, ABC, CBS, if you look at the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, etc., all over the world, you're looking at the people who control those organizations being members of this same roundtable network. Washington Post, Katharine Graham, Bilderberg Group, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, and so it goes on.
And like I said, he was an imperialist. I think it's called Zambia now, the African nation of Zambia. But President Woodrow Wilson was inspired by a similar concept to draw up his plans for the League of Nations in the aftermath of World War I. Most fascist regimes in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s of the 20th century also proposed from some sort of New World Order. So it is alleged that a lot of these fascists were actually globalists, and they were pushing for Hitler, and the Nazis were actually looking to implement a New World Order. So there's many different people that had the same idea, and many of these strategies are similar. In fact, the New Order, H.G. Wells, who wrote you may be familiar with the War of the Worlds, he wrote what was called the Open Conspiracy in 1928, in which he describes his efforts to get the intellectuals to back the idea of a world social democracy and the New World Order in 1940, in which he details how a generation of struggle will be necessary to overcome the opponents of such global government. So H.G. Wells wrote this writing called the Open Conspiracy. He wrote it and he talked about there's plans in order to get a New World Order. Now here's the 10 proposed regions for the New World Order, and I'm going to show you a map of that. So one is the United States of America, which is the U.S., Canada, all Central America and Caribbean states, most Atlantic islands including Greenland and Iceland, and most Pacific islands, Taiwan, Hainan, the Philippines, and several now Indonesian islands, including Sulawesi. This was to be the dominant power in the world, military and otherwise. So that's one of the reasons why the United States kind of occupied the Philippines for a while. It was part of one of the 10 proposed regions. If you understand some of the trade agreements, like the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Clintons were really prominent in putting that in place, and I'm going to show you how these things connect. But the North American Free Trade Agreement was connecting United States, Mexico, and Canada. And what the ultimate goal of that trade agreement was not to strengthen Mexico, but it was to tear down the strength of the United States and Canada. It was, a lot of times they talk about transference of wealth. So it's not, that's why they start to ship a lot of jobs to Mexico and overseas, because what it does is it strengthens those places' economy at the sake or the cost of the United States, which is all part of the overall plan. Section 2 was the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, or Russia. The Soviets were to be rewarded with Persia, which was Iran, Mongolia, Manchuria, Finland, and all of Eastern Europe, which subsequently would be part of the Eastern Bloc, excluding Albania, but including the real-life maverick state of Yugoslavia, socialist but anti-Soviet. All these states were simply to become member states of the USSR. Section 3, the United States of America, of South America, including South American states with 3 Ghanas as a single constituent state in the Falkland Islands. Segment 4, the Union of the African Republics, so all of Africa as a republic, a federation of republics. Section 5, the Arabian Federated Republics, or the AFR, covering Saudi and all the other states now occupying the Arabian Peninsula, plus present-day Iraq and Syria. Section 6, the Federated Republics of India, present-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Burma, Myanmar. Segment 7, the United Republics of China, Federation including all the parts of the present-day China, Korea, and erstwhile French colony of Indochina, which is now Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, Thailand, and Malaya. United States of Scandinavia, which is Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. United States of Europe, the British Commonwealth of Nations. So these are the 10 segments. So British Commonwealth of Nations, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, Madagascar, and most of Indonesia. The United States of Europe is Benelux, German Rhineland, France, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Now, Agenda 21. Agenda 21 in Sustainable Development is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations systems, governments, and major groups in every area which the human impacts on the environment. So, like I said, the overall strategy is to consolidate the nations into 10 segments, and I just mentioned some of the segments. And so one of their plans, one of their strategies is called Agenda 21.
At its core, Agenda 21 is about control. Control over land, natural resources, and entire populations. It seeks to control the air by regulation of carbon emissions, the ground by sustainable development, and the sea through environmental regulations. Officially stated, Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations system, governments, and major groups in every area in which human impacts on the environment. Because being human will always have an impact on the environment, Agenda 21 paves the way for extraordinary UN control. When you boil it down, there are 9 basic tenets of Agenda 21. Move citizens off private land and into urban housing. Create vast wilderness spaces inhabited by large carnivores. Eliminate cars and create walkable cities. Support chosen private businesses with public funds for sustainable development. Make policy decisions that favor the greater good over individuals. Drastically reduce the use of power, water, and anything else that creates carbon pollution. Use bureaucracies to make sweeping decisions outside of democratic processes. Increase taxes, fees, and regulations. And finally, implement policies meant to incentivize a reduced population.
This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to 0. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to 0. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to 0. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
sustainable development. And that's the key. We're going to get back to Cecil Rhodes and the Clintons, but first I want you to understand what Agenda 21 is and how this all ties in together. So Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, and the Statement of Principles for the Sustainable Management of Forests were adopted by more than 178 governments in the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992, June 1992. So the Commission of Sustainable Development was created in December of 1992 to ensure the effective follow-up on this agenda, to monitor and report on implementation of the agreements at the local, national, regional, and international levels. It was agreed that a 5-year review on Earth Summit progress would be made in 1997 by the United Nations General Assembly meeting in a special session. The full implementation of Agenda 21, the program for further implementation of Agenda 21 and the commitments to the Rio Principles were strongly reaffirmed at the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg, South Africa from 26 August to 4th September of 2002. Now, the agenda was recently renamed Agenda 2030. Agenda 21 meant the agenda for the 21st century. Now it's been named to 2030 because the UN would like to have their plan fully implemented by the year 2030. Agenda 21's ultimate goal is to reduce the population of the world to between 500 million and 1 billion people. Currently, there's 7 billion people in the world. So think about a strategy or plan that reduces the population from 7 billion down to 1 billion. That's pretty dramatic. They also look to hoard people in large cities because it's easier to control the masses. So they have certain zones. I talked about the 10 segments, and I'm going to show you a picture of the map for the United States, that they have consolidated all the people into certain cities, and then they have huge amounts of land where human beings aren't going to be allowed to live. And again, this might sound like conspiracy, but it's a plan that was already implemented. They're putting it in place. It's interesting that the Clintons put us on that. That President Trump, he took us off the Paris Climate Agreement, and a lot of people were up in arms because they didn't understand it. And I also want you to understand that this is tied into economics as well, because I told you economics is one of the key factors in any type of nation and how stable they are or whatever agenda is being pushed.
My solemn duty to protect America and its citizens. The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. So we're getting out. But we will start to negotiate, and we will see if we can make a deal that's fair. And if we can, that's great. And if we can't, that's fine. As president, I can put no other consideration before the well-being of American citizens. The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production.
Now, as I stated before, Cecil Rhodes, so in a modern context, well, let me read this part too. So they want to gather people into cities, and a lot of rural areas, like I said, will be considered wilderness areas where only wildlife managers and researchers will be allowed. And there were certain states that have voted against that already. But and like we said just recently, President Trump last year in 2017, he voted to take us off the Paris Climate, which is part of the Agenda 21. Now, what they did is they came up with this concept. It was called global warming at first, and Al Gore really pushed this. It was part of their Agenda 21 for population control. And you have to understand that these things are part of the ancient religion. So what they say basically is that human beings are the problem. So with global warming, what they say, CO2. If you have too much CO2, they say it raises the temperature of the planet, so we got to reduce CO2. But see, what they're not telling you is that they do tell you that human beings create CO2, but think about it from a biological standpoint. As a human being, I breathe in oxygen and I exhale CO2, carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide is what I exhale. Plants ingest carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. So it's a cycle that was created that actually helps to sustain life in the planet. The more greenery we have, the more oxygen is created, the more oxygen human beings breathe in, the healthier they are. So this notion that, somehow or another, what they're saying is we need less CO2. So in order to get less CO2, they're saying we have to reduce the population. And again, this is not my opinion. I'm going to show you a couple of clips of some of the globalists that you may or may not know of that actually says these same things. So Cecil Rhodes, he was a British imperialist, and of course is where you get the name Rhodesia from. He was named after Cecil Rhodes, which is a South African nation. It's no longer called Rhodesia. They changed the name. I think it's Zimbabwe now, or Zaire, one of those nations. I'm sorry, I don't have the name in front of me. He first proposed the federal world government to be imposed by the U.S. and the British Empire. Cecil Rhodes, he was a pure globalist, and he lived from July of 1853 to March of 1902. He's a British businessman, mining magnate, and politician in Southern Africa, who served as Prime Minister of Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896. He was an ardent believer in British imperialism. Rhodes and his British South African company founded the Southern African Territory of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and Zambia, which the company named after him in 1895. He's also, if you ever heard of De Beers Diamond Company, he was one of the founders of De Beers. He wanted to expand the British Empire because he believed that the Anglo-Saxon race was destined to greatness. In his last will and testament, Rhodes said of the English, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." So, of course, we talk about globalism. They wanted to expand all over the world. Rhodes wanted to make the British Empire a superpower in which all the British-dominated countries in the empire, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Cape Colony, would be represented in the British Parliament. Rhodes included American students as eligible for the Rhodes Scholarships. He said that he wanted to breed an American elite of philosopher kings who would have the United States rejoin the British Empire, as Rhodes also respected and admired the Germans and their Kaiser. He allowed German students to be included in the Rhodes Scholarships. He believed that eventually the United Kingdom, including Ireland, the U.S. and Germany together, would dominate the world and ensure perpetual peace. Now that's the key, right? So he came up with the Rhodes Scholar. He let United States students also get included. He was the founder, like I said, of the De Beers Company, which still controls 60% of the rough diamond markets. And at one point in time, it controlled 90% of the diamond markets. He also formed a secret round table in order to recruit intelligent men and women to the cause of the British imperialism. Those who receive the Rhodes Scholarship are summarily sent to Oxford in England for their education and indoctrination. Under the cunning guise of extending the domination of the Anglo-Saxon race, he successfully furthered the interests of his royal masters of England, the various Antinous dynasties of Europe. Now, the Rothschild, Mayor Rothschild, who's the Rothschild family, the international banking global elite, actually were the group that helped to fund his business enterprise in Southern Africa and his push for a global government.
Black Labor Exploitation by Cecil John Rhodes and De Beers from 1870. Presently, De Beers Group controls diamond trade in most of the world, but in Africa, they control trade in South Africa and Botswana more directly. Other countries that attempt to sell diamonds through other channels other than the ones controlled by De Beers end up in some kind of civil war, domestic destabilization, namely Sierra Leone, Liberia, the DRC, Angola, and so forth. If they do not control it, they will contribute to the chaos. The wealth and power and influence of De Beers was built on the back of black Africans exploited from the 1870s until now. Even in present-day South Africa, they continued to influence politics and government to keep their empire growing. Rhodes and the creation of De Beers from 1870. The Kimberly mines were the foundation for racial segregation and black labor exploitation in South Africa. Many mine owners were unhappy with the limited pool of labor and the increase in wages as demand was significantly higher than the market could supply. So in 1872, there were about 1,600 diamond claim holders at Kimberly, but by 1877 there were only about 300, and by 1879 there were only 12 partnerships or private companies that controlled almost 3/4 of the diamond production at Kimberly. This was in part due to the Claim Limitation Law of 1876, which ended the small independent diamond production and created a new era of highly capitalized diamond production. By the 1880s, De Beers had seized control of the Kimberly mine through devious takeovers, buyouts, and consolidations. In March 1888, the De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited was incorporated as a major holding company, and by 1891 they had the monopoly over diamond trade at Kimberly. De Beers was created by Cecil John Rhodes. Rhodes obtained a trust deed which permitted his company to engage in any business enterprise, to annex land in any part of Africa, and to govern foreign territories and maintain armies in those territories when necessary. He appointed life governors who would control De Beers through the duration of their lives. These governors were Alfred Bate, Barney Banato, Frederick Thomas, Phillips, and Stowe. De Beers quickly became one of the most profitable companies in the world. Labor shortages and exploitation. However, there were still labor shortages at Kimberly, so they introduced laws to force more Africans into the mining labor market. In November 1876, white farmers were granted landholding rights in Griqualand West. African populations were moved to crowded areas that would force them to seek employment in the mines. Heart tax and later poll tax was imposed on Africans, which forced many to seek employment on farms and in the mines. However, the demand for labor at Kimberly still outpaced supply until they sought the help of João Albacini, an old Portuguese slave dealer who promised to recruit workers as far as 1,600 kilometers away up to the Mozambican coast. Africans there were promised wages, food, protection, and safety, but once they arrived at Kimberly, they were subjected to deplorable conditions. Work conditions at Kimberly were similar to slavery. In August 1876, the Labor Commission introduced localization, which created closed living quarters for mining laborers. Through localization, 22,000 Africans were forced to live in 7 locations, which limited their interaction with the outside community. After localization, the Labor Commission granted employers the right to reduce wages to 10 shillings per week. Africans were further sidelined through the Diamond Trade Act of 1882. Through this law, anyone found in possession of a diamond was guilty until proven innocent and was to be denied a jury trial. And if convicted by a judge, which happened in more instances, one would be punished with 15 years in prison, a £1,000 fine, and if the perpetrator was African, they would be whipped. Early in prison industrial complex. In spite of these efforts, labor shortages continued at Kimberly until they sought another method: imprisonment and forced labor. In 1882, the average police officer made about 45 arrests, but at Kimberly, they arrested between 114 and 160 people on average. The number of inmates at Kimberly was about 7 times higher than in any part of the country, and once they realized they could exploit prison labor, De Beers Mining Company signed an agreement with the state to establish private prisons where inmates could be used as mine labor. De Beers continued until 1932, which further increased their profitability. In 1889, Africans who were not in prison were housed in closed compounds in the 7 locations established at Kimberly. African laborers were paid a wage but forced to buy food and supplies from the compound store owned by De Beers. Laborers were closely monitored in those compounds and could not leave until their contract had ended. In present-day South Africa, De Beers Consolidated Mines Company controls the primary South African sources of diamonds, including 7 large diamond mounds around the country, and the De Beers operations account for about 94% of the nation's total diamond output. In Botswana, the diamond trading company Botswana DTC Botswana is a 50-50 joint venture partnership between the government of the Republic of Botswana and De Beers Group.
Now here's some of the Rhodes Scholars, people that were previously Rhodes Scholars. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Cory Booker, who is a senator now, currently. Bobby Jindal, who was the governor of Louisiana. George Stephanopoulos, you guys are probably familiar with him. He's a news reporter on Good Morning America. He's been around for some time. He also worked for the Clinton family. They're both Rhodes Scholars. Susan Rice, and you guys are familiar with him from the Obama administration, and Rachel Maddow, who is on MSNBC, very liberal commentator on MSNBC. Bill Clinton was, like I said, not only was Bill Clinton a Rhodes Scholar, and I told you what Cecil Rhodes was a part of and believed in. They recruited people to help the globalist agenda. He also was the president that put the United States on Agenda 21, sustainable development. And so it's no coincidence. And here's a New York Times article, June 21st, 2017. And like I said, I've been saying this over and over again, and some people are starting to believe it, but President Trump is not a globalist. He's a nationalist, and he's actually battling against the globalists, which is why the system is so enraged against him. And they're manipulating the masses. So mainstream media is owned by the globalists. The Bilderberg Group and all that, these other groups are part of the globalist agenda, and so that's why mainstream media is against him. Politicians, a lot of these politicians are globalists behind the scenes and part of these secret societies and organizations. But in June 21st, 2017, President Trump announced Thursday that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. And so first they said global warming, now they're saying climate change, and that's part of the Agenda 21, but it's actually part of control and population control of the masses, globalization, and population control. The Georgia Guidestones, they have this big statue in Georgia, and they outline the globalist agenda, and the first point of that is to keep the population down near 500 million. Ted Turner is a globalist. He's the founder of CNN, and he himself said that we have too many people. We need less people so that we can have more resources for those people that are here. He's a globalist. Like I said, he's the founder of CNN. But here's what President Trump said, and this is why I say that we have to really understand what's going on. And some people ask me why I have supported him. I support his policies. Many of his policies, I don't like how he acts. I don't like how he insults people, obviously. But what I'm saying is the principles that he ran on, that he campaigned on, and some of the stuff that he's fighting against is globalism. And globalism is our biggest threat. Globalism is the biggest threat to the middle class and the lower class, and more specifically minorities, because minorities get hit the hardest by the globalist agendas. Here's what the New York Times article says. It says, when he pulled us off the Paris Climate Accord, weakening efforts to combat global warming and embracing isolationist voices in the White House who argued that the agreement was a pernicious threat to the economy and American sovereignty. This is what Trump said. He says that accord was a threat to our economy and to the sovereignty of America. And I'm telling you, this is the stuff that I already knew and I had studied. So when he started saying that, I knew he was telling the truth, even though a lot of people didn't pick up on it. In a speech from the Rose Garden, Mr. Trump said that the Landmark 2015 Pact imposed wildly unfair environmental standards on American businesses and workers. He vowed to stand with the people of the United States against what he called a draconian international deal. I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris. The president said, drawing support from members of the Republican Party, but widespread condemnation from political leaders, business executives, and environmentalists around the globe. See, these globalists are upset with him by what he said, but he was being very honest and very insightful about what these type of agreements stand for. Now let me break it down biblically for you. So we know the story of Nimrod in Genesis 11. Nimrod built a city called Babel. Nimrod represents rebellion against God. Babel also means confusion. He gathered all the nations of the world together. It was a society in which the people turned away from worshiping God and following God's commandments or his laws. Nimrod made sure that all the material needs of the people were met and their food and shelter needs were taken care of. He also was a mighty warrior and promised to keep the people safe from anyone that would harm them, including God. The Bible tells us that there is coming a time in which this will come full circle. So Mystery Babylon is coming back again because that's what the Bible tells us. 1 Thessalonians 5, it says, while people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. So when the masses say peace and safety, they're calling for peace and safety, that's when sudden destruction is coming. Now, why is that? That's because when we understand this global system of government, it will be ruled by an antichrist or the rebirth of the Nimrod, the antichrist. So the people will do like they traditionally have done, like the communists have tried to do, is get the people dependent on the government instead of God. They will worship God. They will look for the government to take care of their financial needs at the sake of their relationship with God. And they will say peace and safety, and the Bible says that's when destruction comes, because that's when they will be taken over by this system of government that's meant to oppress and destroy the people. Now here's the ironic thing, like we were talking about this, and let me tie this together for you. In September 15th of 2017, the United Nations dedicates annual Peace Day to safety, respect for refugees and immigrants. So this is all tying in together. The United Nations called September 15th, 2017, Annual Peace Day to safety, respect for refugees and migrants. The United Nations in New York today marked the International Day of Peace with the annual ringing of the bell and calls for combatants worldwide to lay down their arms and observe the day of ceasefire and nonviolence. When more and more doors and minds are being closed to refugees, let us show solidarity. So that's that word, unity, solidarity. Secretary General Antonio Guterres said at the ceremony, which focuses attention this year on the spirit of Together, a global initiative led by the UN to promote respect, safety, and dignity for refugees and immigrants. Let us highlight the shared benefits of migration to economies and to the nations. When others receive the support they need and deserve, we are all more secure and better off. Peace and safety, right? Security. He added, the Secretary General joined the UN Messenger of Peace, Jane Goodall, as well as Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed and the President of the General Assembly, Miroslav Lajcak, thanked those participating for their efforts in working towards world peace. When they say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. Now let me finish with this. In 1 Thessalonians 5, it reads, now concerning the times and the season, brothers, you have no need to have anything written to you, for you yourselves are fully aware that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. While people are saying there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. For you are all children of the light, children of the day. We are not of the night or of the darkness. So then let us not sleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be sober, having put on the breastplate of faith and love, and for the helmet of hope of salvation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. Therefore encourage one another and build one another up, just as you are doing. This has been Dr. Joe Green, and thank you again for tuning in. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and to the Patreon, and I just pray that that you are blessed by this message and let it edify you. And please share it with others. Like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Be blessed of the Lord.
over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's